for you both. What was it that motivated the two of you to create the Cubed?
Well, the cube goes, for me, it goes back a lot of years, over 20 years ago, working in the schools as a speech language pathologist. And I saw the approaches that were taken to try to measure reading comprehension and language comprehension. And those traditional approaches had to be efficient, and I knew that, and they had to be reliable. But I really had concerns about the validity of the approaches that were being taken. And that definitely germinated and festered for a long time. And in that kind of, I held that for a while inside of me with this idea that we really probably should try to come up with innovative ways to measure language that are both efficient, reliable, and valid. And I was very fortunate to meet Trina Spencer in our PhD program, and we both had such an emphasis on language and understood the importance of language.
Well, I
And
really didn't, not at that time yet.
I
Let
don't
me
want
let me tell my
I don't want
story
to
and then we'll
well, I don't want to
converge right
disagree with
there.
you. Wait, I just want to say one thing. When I first met you, you did tell me that there was something about language that you felt that we really needed to focus on. You,
Okay, let
at
me
least
tell
at
you
that
how I
time.
got to that statement. Okay, so I was a practitioner, a school psychologist in the New York City area, and I was very well trained in phonics-based literacy or reading instruction, and like precision teaching, direct instruction, and the assessment approach that was popularized around that time was criterion reference or curriculum-based measurement using a fluency approach, right? So all of our measures were like 1-minute timings of oral reading fluency. And I was big into that. And I knew that stuff really well. As a school psychologist, I supported my districts. I supported all these teachers. But when it came to a subgroup of students I was working with, that fluency didn't look right to me. And so I started asking them more questions like, well, tell me what you read. Tell me about that story. Or asking like comprehension questions. And they would give me this blank look like, I got no clue. I'm like, okay, you just read that 180 words a minute and you got no clue what was in it. And as a practitioner, that, oh my gosh, it really disturbed me that I had been teaching these kids to be more fluent, but that it didn't actually serve the purpose of reading in the first place. And I was a practitioner. I was like, I have got to go back to school because I scoured the journals and found nothing. So language never came up. I never saw it. But I was like, there's something wrong here. There's something missing. And these kids cannot comprehend what they read. And so now in 2006, when you and I became doc students at the same time, within weeks of entering school, because I now had access to all this like journals and articles and stuff, I remember printing, I had a stack like this big. Every single one of them was language is critical for comprehension. Language is critical for comprehension. And I was like, oh my gosh, we're missing language. In all of every evidence-based strategy for teaching reading was about decoding and fluency. And I couldn't handle that. So yes, by that time, probably just within a couple weeks, I had learned, it's about language. But those are like deep in the journal articles, and there wasn't a lot of direction of what to do. So that's where you and I started talking like, hey, now we've got this common problem. Language is comprehension.
Yeah,
Right?
and the some also very influential in my life were like experiences I had taking classes from Dr. Carol Strong. And Carol Strong emphasized how important oral language is and how you can assess oral language and improve oral language with really young children, that you don't have to wait until they can decode. You don't have to wait for reading fluency for them to build their language nor to measure it. And so that's partially what motivated the creation of the Cubed also, was this idea that we should be measuring oral language as early as we can in the schools, and then also measure, of course, their a child's ability to understand and produce that
Yeah.
complex language.
And then the other piece of this, the actual first beginnings of the cubed were the measurement tool that Doug and I developed to be able to assess progress in an intervention. We did a narrative intervention with young preschoolers. And I just thought, okay, language, we're going to measure language comprehension, and this has got to be out there somewhere. So when I was doing kind of like searching for the right tool, turns out it didn't exist. And so I said, so Doug, it doesn't exist, but I still want to do this study. We need a measure that does this, right? And really has like the curriculum-based measurement criteria, which is multiple parallel forms. That's a big one. It has to be reliable, it has to be valid, it has to be something socially meaningful or academically meaningful. And it has to be easy to do. And so that like teachers and, clinicians can be able to do it. So I had that knowledge of curriculum-based measurement based on all of the fluency stuff. And I was influenced by the Dibble and AimsWeb developers. So Mark Shin, Ruth Kaminsky, Roland Good, they were kind of in my background. I had training from those people. So I understood those criteria very well. And so when we kind of put our heads together, he knew about language. I was just appreciating language at the time, and I knew how to develop the assessment tool based on these criteria.
Yeah,
Would you say that was the ta-da?
yeah, and we've got to give credit to the amazing Dr. Ron Gillum at Utah State University, who said, these assessments that you put together for your dissertation, Trina,
Yeah.
he said, there's probably a broader application here to this that could be expanded outside of a dissertation. And I'm sure that didn't take very long for us to think that that's pretty obvious. Yes.
Well, what's so funny is in my dissertation defense, Ron says, okay, so how do the SLPs buy this assessment tool from you? And I was like, huh? Wait, what? And he's like, every SLP in the country is going to need that. And then he's, and we were like, okay. And I said, Doug, is that true? Like, do we need to do this? So anyway,
Yeah.
but at the time it was just the NLM listening for preschool. That's where we started. That's where some of the stuff was. But of course, once we actually were talking to SLPs and teachers, we realized and Doug already knew, like Doug knew that there was a need. I was still a newcomer to this content. So I was like, okay, we can do this. We can fully develop for pre-K up and add more stories, add a reading, add some decoding and reading comprehension pieces. So anyway, humble beginnings.
Yeah, and we also really recognized, sorry, Kristi, you probably had another question, but I just want to say that we really felt very strongly that oral language needed to be measured in the schools with universal screening and progress monitoring, just like was happening and currently still happens with word recognition and decoding related skills. And Trina and I are researchers, and it took a lot of work for us, of course, to develop each of those stories to make them parallel in nature. It's something like 30 to 40 hours per form probably. But the need to put that in the hands of everyone across the world really drove us to just make this into a PDF form and make it free. And we vowed that even though it took so much of our effort and time out of our lives, it was a passion project, and it seemed obvious to us that this needed to be free so that couldn't be a barrier to implementation.
That was nice, Doug. Thank you for speaking our values.
Oh, I love that. And I want to expound on that too, because you talk about these gaps that you saw in assessment, but how do you feel these gaps and weaknesses were further filled in with using the cubed in tandem with Story Champs, which you also developed? Could you speak on how those play into each other as well?
Sure. Weighing a pig doesn't make it grow, but what gets tested gets taught, right? So oral language or oral academic language is never going to be promoted in schools standardly unless we're measuring it. And in fact, we already know from lots of years of experience that teachers will tend to teach exactly what the test is testing, right? And not like the more global or the more integrated dimensions of this complex academic language. And so that was really important that our assessment tools address that in its more global, sophisticated form, but in a simple way, so that we could get from that assessment into an intervention that would drive them into, this is what I need to teach. And teaching should not just be relegated or restricted to vocabulary words or spelling words, or, you know what I mean? Like we can teach this entire complex oral language system in a simple way, right? Without fracturing it, or without isolating your teaching drills and things like that, which teaching vocabulary sometimes feels like that because it's just like memorize this word, you know? But anyway,
Yeah, and for
if they
the
don't, sorry, go ahead. You'll finish the answer.
no, I didn't. Sorry, I thought you were done. I'm sorry. Well, I was just going to say, for the longest time, we have understood that that language needs to be taught in a contextualized manner, and yet at the same time, it needs to be explicit and systematic. And I mean, you can go back to things written by amazing speech language pathology and other education researchers about language instruction. And I mean, no science is settled by any means, but what emerges to the top constantly and consistently is this idea of contextualized language intervention, which entails systematic and explicit and cumulative instruction. And you can't have that if you don't know what you're treating, what you're trying to teach. And so the CUBE provides very, very explicit information on what a child needs to focus on to improve their complex academic language. And so that's how it dovetails beautifully. And the development of the CUBE happened in tandem with Story Champs. The reason why we did the CUBED assessment was to monitor the progress of the students that we were working with in contextualized language intervention. So that's kind of the relationship. It's incredibly tight, right, between the two. One informs the instruction.
Yeah, and while I'm a school psychologist, assessment is not my love. It really is not. I only assess if it's going to be meaningful for decisions regarding instruction and intervention. Now, of course, if you want good instruction and intervention, you have to have excellent assessment tools. And so they go in tandem. You have to have both. And so for me, I develop assessment tools, and I really kind of like just try to be Doug's sidekick because it doesn't excite me as much as the intervention does. But you give me an intervention and I'm just like, oh my gosh, like I could live in this space, right? But I know the meaning and the necessity of the assessment for good instruction and intervention. And that's just, schools too often have become like, we test for mandated purposes or test for regulatory purposes to see which kids get held back, whatever. But oftentimes those assessment tools and the data are not linking them to very direct instructional decisions based on data. And so that's kind of a value of us, that we put these things together and that we don't just have an assessment tool without an intervention or vice versa. And we've also seen schools that, let's say, adopt the CUBE, but they didn't want the intervention. They didn't want to do anything about it at first, so they could only handle the assessment. So they do that. But then guess what happens? All the teachers go, but oh my gosh, my kids need this. Where is that? How do I do this? How can I now teach them this? Now that I know that they're missing these pieces, how do I teach them? And then we say, oh, well, here you go.